Hare Krishna. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. So today we will continue a discussion on the nectar of devotion. We will be doing the 15th chapter of the NOD titled Spontaneous Devotional Service. So this the flow so far has been that we have been mostly or primarily discussing Vaidhi Bhakti. And in the second wave of the Eastern Ocean, which talks about Sadhana Bhakti, there are two divisions, Vaidhi and Raghunag. So in the previous chapter, we concluded the discussion of the Sadhana Vaidhi Bhakti. Right. So now from the 15th chapter, we will talk about the Sadhana Raghunag Bhakti. So there are two chapters that we will cover in this discussion that talks about Raghunag Bhakti in the category of sadhana. So before we talk about Raghunag Bhakti, we need to understand what Ragatmika Bhakti is, because Raghunag Bhakti is the following of the Ragatmika Bhaktas, right? So that is why Srila Rupa Goswami, before talking about the Raghunagas, the followers, talks about those that they follow, which are the Ragatmikas. So literally, Rag means intense attachment for Krishna, and Atma, as you know, means the very essence. So Ragatmika means those whose very essence is an intense attachment for Krishna. Right? Another way of understanding this is that Rag means color, and Atma again means self. So just like when one wears red colored eyeglass, then everything around is tinged with redness. Similarly, for the Ragatmika Bhaktas, because their essence is love for Krishna, everything that they see around themselves, they see in relationship to Krishna. Everything that they do, every thought that they have is in relationship with Krishna. Rupa Goswami also makes this point of distinguishing between raga in the material world. Right? So material world also we see intense attachment, but the motivation is different. In the material world, the motivation is satisfying one's own senses. In the spiritual conception, it is satisfying Krishna. So Rupa Goswami defines Ragatmika Bhakti as spontaneous attraction for something while completely absorbed in thoughts of it with an intense desire of love. Then this point is also made that Ragatmika Bhaktas can only be found in Vrindavan and to some extent in Dwarka. Right? Because in Ragatmika, the mood is that of spontaneity. Right? The motivation is pure love for Krishna. That is only found in Vrindavan. Everywhere else, the love for Krishna is to some extent covered with the awe and reverence for him. So even in Dwarka, there is some level of deference. The wives of Krishna, they treat him with a lot of deference and respect, as a wife would treat a husband. Not so in Vrindavan. Right? So the point is made is that if one remains preoccupied with the awareness of Krishna's majestic lordliness, then it is still Vaidhi Bhakti. And because there is the restraint of formal etiquette. Now one thing we'll see is um, the mood of Rupa Goswami of first trying to clearly define the Ragatmikas, because only in their context can we understand the Ragunagas, right? And we see Srila Prabhupada, in some cases, he will interchangeably use the terms Ragatmika, Ragunagas, just because their mood is same. While one is perfected, the other is seeking perfection. So, conclusion is that the Ragatmika bhaktas can only be found in Vrindavan. Now, in terms of actual moods, there is this verse of Narad Muni in 7.131. It's conversation between Narad Muni and Yudhishthir Maharaj, in which he says that, my dear King Yudhishthir, the gopis by the lusty desires, Kamsa by his fear, Shishupal and other kings by envy, the Yadus by their familiar relationship with Krishna, you Pandavas by your great affection for Krishna, and we, the general devotees, by our devotional service, have obtained the mercy of Krishna. Right? So he essentially talks about 6 kinds of devotees that are absorbed in thoughts of Krishna. Right? And what is the motivation? So first he talks about Gopya Kamat, right? That they're thinking with Krishna in Kam Roop. Right? And later on we'll see that the Kam of the gopis is not the Kam that we consider in the material world. Second is Bhayat Kamsa, right? That out of fear, Kamsa was constantly thinking of Krishna, that when will Krishna come and kill me? Then Shishupal out of envy, right? And his friends, the other kings of Shaidya, they were so envious. Shishupal was so envious of Krishna that he almost made it a practice for blaspheming Krishna at least 100 times every day. And so that was the extent of his envy. But the side result of it was that he was constantly thinking of Krishna. Then the Vrishnis and the Yadus in kinship, right? So this is Sambandh Rupa. Then the Pandavas in affection, and the general devotees, Narad Muni includes himself out of humility, in bhaktiya, in general devotional service. So out of these 6, right, 4 are excluded from Ragatmika Bhakti, which is fear, envy, respectful affection, and obedient devotion. Right? And the reasons will be explained in the next slides. So the 2, which is Kamarup, the mood of the gopis, and Sambandharup, which is the mood of the Vrishnis, are genuine categories of Ragatmika Bhakti. So while all 6 of them are constantly absorbed in thinking about Krishna, only 2 of them reach the spiritual Vrindavan. Right? Those who have the mood of the gopis, and those who have the mood of the Yadavs and Vrishnis. Now there are 2 which have negative feelings, which is in fear like Kamsa and in envy like Shishupal. They do not. So because they are thinking of Krishna, they do get liberation, but into the impersonal Brahman. Because essentially their mood is to destroy the personal form of Krishna. So they're liberated into the impersonal form of Krishna. And then 5 and 6, which is the Pandavas and the devotees in general, they are still covered with Aishwarya Bhav. Right? So they're still they have still not reached the maturity of spontaneous bhakti. So they are considered to be sadhakas, and by the mercy of another advanced devotee, or because of their own reciprocation with Krishna, they may mature into one of the purified stages. So the essence of sadhana bhakti is absorption of the mind in Krishna. Right? That was the Paribhash Sutra, that one should always remember Krishna and never forget Krishna. That is the essence of sadhana bhakti. Right? Now, when one is spontaneously attracted to Krishna, then the absorption of the mind in Krishna is even stronger. So when one is doing sadhana Vedi bhakti, then they rely on the vidhis, the rules and regulations to think about Krishna. Well, now I have to chant. So for the 2 hours that one is chanting, they're thinking of Krishna. I have to do deity worship. So while they're doing deity worship, they're thinking of Krishna. So they rely on these rules and regulations to help them think of Krishna. But when they have matured from that stage, then they're spontaneously thinking of, of Krishna, which is the perfection of sadhana bhakti. Right? So the goal of sadhana bhakti is continuous absorption of the mind in Krishna, which is achieved by this spontaneous devotion. Right? So the point that is made is that the spontaneous devotion represents a maturity of the Vaidhi or the regulated bhakti stage. So once again, one might say that Kamsa and Shishupal were spontaneously and obsessively thinking of Krishna, but again, they were thinking of Krishna in a negative way. So to some extent, this is Kyumutarnya. That even so, Nadmuni is saying that the power of thinking about Krishna is so strong that even if one thinks about Krishna in fear or envy, even then he says they get a similar destination as the gopis, right? Not the same destination. Similar means it's there, it is not there in the material world, it's in the spiritual world. But it's inferior because it is in the Brahman. So it is not that one is recommended to become inimical to Krishna in order to make advancement. Because if you remember our very first discussion on the definition of bhakti, anukulena is the important component of Shuddha Bhakti. So anukulena means that one should think of Krishna in a favorable way. So people like Shashupal and Kamsa, even though they're thinking of Krishna because it's not in a favorable way, what they're executing is not bhakti. But yet they're superior to kings like Vena, who were also sinful, like Kamsa and Shishupal, but were not thinking about Krishna. Right? So such souls, they were actually sent into the hellish planets. And so that is the redeeming quality of absorbing one's mind in Krishna. Now the very next verse to the 7131 is that somehow or other one must consider the forms of Krishna seriously. Then by one of the 5 different processes mentioned above, one can return home back to Godhead. Atheists like King Vena, however, being unable to think of Krishna's form in any of these 5 ways, cannot attain salvation. Therefore, one must somehow think of Krishna, whether in a friendly or inimical way. Yena kena prakarena Krishna mana deveshya. So Narad Muni, in the mood of a preacher, is casting a wide net. Right? So he's saying that if you have to hate somebody, hate Krishna. Right? If you have to be envious of somebody, be envious of Krishna. It does not mean that he's saying that that's the recommended way. But the absorption in Krishna somehow or the else will take one to some form of perfection. If one is negatively absorbed in Krishna, one gets a lower form of perfection, like the impersonal Brahman. And if one is perfectly absorbed in Krishna, in the Kam Roop or Bhava Roop, then one gets the perfection of the spiritual life. So ultimately, it is not envy or fear which Narad is recommending. It is not out of duty that Narad is recommending. It is out of love. Okay. So in that verse, two forms were talked about, uh, suitable for ragatmikas. One was kama roop or sensual attraction, and this can be easily misunderstood because lust is also very prominent in the material world. The attraction between a man and a woman. So when one sees the same thing being glorified for spiritual advancements, it is easily to get confused, right? So Prabhupada makes this clear distinction that material calm is the intense thirst to satisfy one's own senses. Spiritual calm is the intense thirst to satisfy Krishna's spiritual senses. Right, so that's the difference. That when we look at lust in the material world, we're looking at ourselves. We are at the center. When we look at the lust in the spiritual world, then the desire is to serve uh, Krishna. So, uh, Srila Prabhupada and Rupa Goswami uses the word lust because there is no equivalent word in the lexicon of the material world that describes this relationship. The closest that comes is lust, which is a very, very strong absorption in something, right? But one should not confuse the two, right? Because the motivations are completely different. So Prabhupada says the gopis' ecstatic love for Krishna is sometimes described by scholars as being like the lusty desire of the material world, but actually this should not be taken as a literal fact. It is simply a way of trying to understand the transcendental situation. So the example of Uddhav is given to talk about the purity of spiritual lust. That Uddhav was a great scholar and a great devotee of the Lord, but yet it was when he saw the gopis' so-called lust for Krishna, he immediately aspired to become become uh, become a creeper in Vrindavan, so that the dust from the gopis' feet could fall on him once in a while. Right? So when if there was any traces of material lust in the gopis, then Uddhav would not have glorified them. The example of Kubja also is given as one that had mixed, that when Krishna entered Mathura, then Kubja offered the sandalwood paste to him. And she did it primarily because of her devotion to Krishna, but there was also traces of material attraction, which is why it said that she did not reach she does not have the same position as the gopis. So the summary is that spontaneous attraction or raga is the supreme means of concentrating the mind upon Krishna, right? And the verse talked about the 6 basic types of spontaneous attraction, and all of them were liberating. However, only 2 of the 6 are genuine types of ragatmika bhaktis that will make further progress into Krishna's personal abode. And this was Kama Roop, like the gopis, and the Sambandha Roop, like the Yadavs and the Vrishnis. Now the key point over here made is followers of these ragatmikas are called Raghunatha Bhakti, right? Because essentially we are still in the stage of sadhana bhakti, right? So the topic of ragatmikas is much too elevated for us, but because he wants to talk about Raghunatha Bhakti, Rupa Goswami also gives us a brief introduction to the Ragatmikas or the perfected devotees. Right? So the Raghunath Bhaktis is like the regulated followers of spontaneous devotional service. It's a little bit of a contradiction or oxymoron, but the example that is given is of newly wedded couple that at least traditionally the husband and the wife would not know each other. They were married, and there was no love because they did not know each other, right? But following the rules and regulations of a married life, they would they would live as if they were in love. So this is the mood of the Raghunaks, that they would follow the moods of the perfected one. So the husband and wife in the initial stage, they live as if they are in love. But by doing so, sincerely, love also appears. Right? So this is essentially the progress of the Raghunak, the mood of the Raghunak bhaktas, that they practice as if they have perfected, and by sincerely practicing, that perfection also appears. Okay, so this is the end of the 15th chapter. The 16th chapter continues the discussion on this topic of Raghunath Bhakti. So we had discussed about the Kamarup Ragatmika Bhaktis, which is that of the gopis. We had also briefly talked about the Samandrup Ragatmika Bhaktis, that is the Vrishnis and the and the Yadavas. And the mood is different, but the prevailing emotion is the same, that there is an intense attachment to the service. Right? Kamarup is more conjugal, and Sambandh Rupa is more, could be more in Sakya, Dasya, Vatsalya. But the underlying mood is the desire to intense desire to serve Krishna. Right? Now both the Kamarup and Sambandh describe the eternal residence of Vrindavan, who possess the perfection of spontaneous subjects. Right. So the primary topic of the previous chapter and this chapter is Raghunag Bhakti. Right? So Ragatmikas are introduced just so that we can understand the Raghunag Bhakti. So Prabhupada says that in this stage of devotional service, where regulative principles are followed, there is no necessity of discussing this love, for it must develop of itself at a more advanced stage. Right? So only a glimpse is given so that we can understand how one follows that, but details are not given. So now we come to the main topic, which is Raghunag Bhakti. So Raghunag Bhaktas, they follow in the footsteps of the Ragatmikas, right? And they're endeavoring to achieve the same mood of perfected spontaneous love. Right. So in the previous chapter, we understood what the Ragatmikas are. Now we know what the Raghunags are, that they are endeavoring to follow in the footsteps of the Ragatmikas. So understanding this word Raghunag, so Rag, as we know, is deep spontaneous attachment, passionate love in this context towards Krishna, and Anuga means following or imitation. Right. So Bhakti, of course, means devotion. So a more formal definition of Raghunag Bhakti is emulating the practice of advanced devotees intended to cultivate the sentiment of a particular eternal devotee. So this is the more formal definition of Raghunag. In Nectar of Devotion, Srila Prabhupada describes it in a simple way, that there is a gradual development of the ambition to become like a particular devotee, and this activity is called Raghunag Bhakti. Right? So at the stage of Raghunag, there is a focus on a particular devotee of a particular mood, a particular Ragatmika. Right? In the earlier stages of sadhana bhakti, that focus is not there, and that the mood at that time is primarily to one way or the other develop some attachment to Krishna. And here now the mode is that having developed some attachment to Krishna, the mode is to perfect it by following one who already has that perfect attachment to Krishna. So, what are the qualifications to execute Raguna Bhakti? So, the basic qualification is a natural, spontaneous desire to serve Krishna in a specific relationship. Right? A desire that is typically evoked by hearing about the Leela of the Ragatmikas, or the eternal residence of Krishna. Right? So the key words here is there is a natural and spontaneous desire to serve Krishna. It's not really bound by obligation, by vows, by rules and regulations, but it is naturally there. Now, this desire is followed by lobh. So, lobh is eagerness to achieve the service of a particular ragatmika devotee. Right? So, if one thing can be considered as the essential prerequisite or qualification to execute Raghunath Bhakti, is this lobh. So, lobh is this covetousness, right? Intense covetousness. So, coveting something is desiring it intensely, right? So, at this stage, the desire of the devotee is is to somehow or else please Krishna in a particular way. As long as there is some other desire in the heart, the required intensity of the focus cannot manifest there. Right? That is why this lobha, or this intense desire to serve Krishna in a particular way, is what drives a sadhaka from Vaidhi Bhakti to Raghunath Bhakti. Prabhupada says that we must always remember, however, that such eagerness to follow in the footsteps of the denizens of Raja Vrindavan is not possible unless one is free from material contamination. This is the stage called Anartha Nivriti, which means the disappearance of material contamination. Right? So, Prabhupada cautions that one must not prematurely jump to this stage. Just in their eagerness, if somebody is getting tired of following the rules and regulations, they may just psych themselves into saying that now I have this intense desire to be the follower of some ragatmika. Right? So, from a more analytical perspective, the person should have crossed the stage of anartha nivriti, which means that the predominant anarthas, so anarthas are material contaminations, they should have disappeared. Okay. Prabhupada also makes this point that because anartha nivriti is within the realm of sadhana bhakti, we should understand that Raghunag is also the stage of sadhana bhakti that occurs before bhav and prem. And even though anartha nivriti means eradication of offenses, it is not complete eradication of offenses. There are still traces left. Right? So this point is important to understand that Raghunag, even though it has this look and feel, spontaneity, and no need to follow rules and regulation, but it is well within the realm of sadhana. The difference is that the rules and regulations of Vaidhi Bhakti are replaced by the rules and regulations of following the Ragatmikas. Right? So, in the earlier stages, the 64 items of Bhakti, the 10 do's, the 20 do's, the 44 additional items, the 5 most potent items, they are the ones that guide their devotional service. Right? They are not that important at the stage of Raghunag, but there are still rules and regulations. With that, how does one follow a perfected devotee? One understands the practices of the perfected devotees, and tries to emulate them based on rules and regulations there, right? So the example is that one may study, let's say, maths at a lower grade, and at that time they're studying it just because it's part of the curriculum. The teacher is asking them to study, they're graded. So out of a sense of obligation, they're studying maths. Now there may be a few students who may actually begin to enjoy maths, right? And they decide to do maths at a higher level, at a PhD level. Now, even at a PhD level, they're still studying the maths according to the principles of mathematics, but now they have a more, they're not being forced to study the subject, right? They actually enjoy studying the subject, right? But doesn't mean that they throw out all the rigor of maths, they throw out all the principles of math. So similarly, at the lower stages, bhakti is driven by a sense of obligation, and later on it is driven by spontaneous desires, but nevertheless it is still within the stage of practicing bhakti. So, like we discussed previously, the Raghunag Bhakti appears after Anartha-nivritti Bhakti. So, in the stages of Bhakti advancement by Rupa Goswami, after Anartha-nivritti comes Nishtha, Ruchi, and Ashakti, and after that comes Bhav and Prem. So, essentially, Bhav is the stage of spontaneous devotional service. The first stage of spontaneous devotional service is Bhav. So, Nishtha, Ruchi, Ashakti, they are all within the stages of sadhana bhakti. Right? Now, after Anartha Nivritti, the sadhana Vaidhi bhakti stops. Right? So, Vaidhi means Vidhi, but it is replaced with Raghunag bhakti, which means that you are still following, but you are following the footsteps of the perfected devotees. The second point is Rupa Goswami's placement of the discussion of Raghunag Bhakti, that he discusses it in the second wave, which he calls as exclusively as Sadhana Bhakti. The third wave is Bhav Bhakti, and the fourth wave is Prema Bhakti. So, just by the placement of this topic in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Rupa Goswami is indicating that it is exclusively within Sadhana Bhakti. So, what are some of the practices of Raghunag Bhakti? One is to meditate on the relationship of service between Krishna and his dear devotee. Right. So, as we mentioned, that Raghunag Bhakti is largely dependent on listening to the pastimes of the Ragatmika that they are focusing on. Now, how do they know which Ragatmika to focus on? That is part of the spiritual advancement. Right. So it's not that somebody just picks somebody and say, I like this person, or this particular devotee seems to be privileged. So it's a natural process that happens. Difficult to explain in words, but uh, as one makes advancement in devotional service, and as one gets free of anarthas, then this desire to serve in a particular mood, it automatically comes up. And when that mood comes up, then one also begins to identify with an associate who also has that mood. Right? Now, uh, there are associates of Krishna who have two forms. They have the sadhak rupena and the siddha rupena. Right. So the example that is given is Rupa Goswami. So Rupa Goswami, as a sadhaka, he is in Bhaumya Vrindavan. Right. He is writing books. He's practicing, chanting his rounds, following the regulative principles. And then, as Rupa Manjari, he is there in Golok Vrindavan also, right? And there he is as Rupa Manjari, he is assisting the gopis and serving Krishna. So that is his perfected form. So, so let us assume that there is a practicing devotee who is attracted to Rupa Goswami. Then they would be worshipping on both this. They would be meditating on both these forms. The sadhak rupena, which is the form of Rupa Goswami and Bhaumi Vrindavan, and the Siddha Rupena, which is Rupa Manjari and Golok Vrindavan. Right. Now, the other thing is what to do of the practices of Vaidhi Bhakti. So, important thing to understand is that the practices may not be so for Vaidhi Bhaktas. These practices are their lifeblood. They are the basis, the foundation by which they are executing bhakti. If these practices stop, the bhaktis will dwindle. At the stage of Raghunag, they are not that much dependent on these practices. But that does not mean that they reject those practices. Right? So Raghunag sadhana does not entail a rejection of Vaidhi. Rather, what happens is that they will take a particular aspect of Vaidhi Bhakti that nourishes their mood of following a Ragatmika and execute that. And the other practice of Raghunath Bhakti is that one should physically or mentally live in Vrindavan, because the point has already been made that the Ragatmika Bhaktas only live in Vrindavan and to some extent in Dwarka. So in order to get proximity to those devotees, not physical proximity, but proximity in terms of the mood, one should preferably live in Vrindavan. If they cannot, then at least they should meditate living in Vrindavan. So, a further expansion on the submission of rules in Raghunath Bhakti. So, as it was mentioned that the Raghunath devotees, they do not follow the regulative principles of devotional service very strictly, right? And their mood is more to follow the perfected devotee, the Ragatmikas like Nand Maharaj or Yashoda. So, while the Raghunagas are above the regulative principles, which means that they don't depend on it, but they do not reject it. Right? They can still draw inspiration from it. Right? So, while their motivation for love or raga is not dependent on vidhi or obligation, they may still follow it. The example is between a husband and a wife. So if they may have matured to spontaneous love, but the wife will still follow some rules and regulations, and so will the husbands follow, because to begin with, it is what nourished their bhakti. The last point which is important is when it says that the Raghunags are above the rules, they may be above the rules of Vaidhi Bhakti, but they are not above the rules of the injunctions of Vedic dharmas. Right? So it's not that when a person is at the stage of Raghunag, they start taking liquor or having illicit sex or eating meat, saying that we are now become avaduts and we can we are not dependent on that activities. Right? So morality is not given up. Right? One might say that the gopis gave up their sense of morality, but the gopis, they are ragatmikas, right? So they are perfected devotees. They have the luxury of doing whatever they want in the service to Krishna. Not the Raghunags. The Raghunags are still following by rules and regulations the the Ragatmikas, right? So they are always bound by the principles of morality. And the related point is that if one is advanced in devotion, then morality automatically becomes a component of that. Right? It is difficult to say that one says that I'm an advanced devotee, but I would like to drink liquor, or say, I'm an advanced devotee, but I like to steal. That itself is incongruent. So because of this, there are deviations in Raghunath Bhakti. Right? One of this is this process of Siddha Pranali. Now, Siddha Pranali is a valid process in which, at a very advanced stage, a perfected guru will reveal to a devotee what his eternal form in the spiritual world is. right? So that is called Siddha Pranali. But this is a very, very advanced stage, comes somewhere towards the perfection of one's in the stage of bhava and prem. Like one should not fall into this cheap Siddha Pranali gurus who will take some money and they will whisper into your ears that you're actually a gopi in Krishna's pastimes, or you're a tree on the banks of river Yamuna. So they are all just fallacious. Then some of the other deviation is one should not make a distinction between Braj and Gauradham. Right? One should not make the distinction between Krishna and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Third point we have discussed extensively is that one should not reject the Vaidhi practice. They will not depend on it, but they should not reject it. An example that is given here is deity worship. The deity worship comes within Vaidhi Bhakti, but even a Raghunath Bhakta may worship the deity, but with a more spontaneous mood. Right? They won't reject deity worship. Rupa Goswami illustrates the story of a very advanced devotee who approached Narad Muni and asked for some guidance in terms of so he was so advanced that he was already feeling this Vatsalya Bhav towards Krishna, right? And he asked for guidance from Narad Muni, and then Narad Muni said that you worship the deity of Balgopa, right? So while deity worship is Vaidhi, but it is also nourishing the Raghunath Bhakti. And again, important is one doesn't transcend piety, principles of dharma, regulative principles. The impetus for change is the only difference is that the impetus comes from external submission to internal desire. So the Raghunath Bhakti is divided into two categories following the verse of Narad Muni. So one is called Kamunaga and the other is called Sambandhamaga. So Kamanuga is conjugal love, and this has two subdivisions. One is Sambhog Ichamai. So this is the mood of of of, of being the it's called the mood of a heroine. That Krishna is the hero and I'm the heroine, right? So of being directly in contact with Krishna in conjugal form. This has two subparts, Swakya and Parakriya. Swakya is having a conjugal relationship with Krishna within marriage, like the queens of Dwarka. Parakriya is outside of marriage, like the gopis of Vrindavan. Right? So the Raghunaths are followers of these Ragatmikas. Like the queens of Dwarka, they are Ragatmikas in Swakya Bhav. The gopis in Vrindavan, they are Ragatmikas in the Parakriya Bhav. Right? So the Raghunaths would follow these perfected devotees. The other division of Kamunaga is Tattat Bhav Ichatmika. So this is in the mood of the heroine's maid. Right? So this is essentially Manjari Bhav, where the mood is not so much in associating with Krishna, but in associating with those who associate with Krishna in a conjugal mood. Right? So the Manjaris, they assist the gopis assist Srimati Radharani. Right? So the mood is conjugal, but there is no direct interaction between Krishna and the Manjaris. The Manjaris' perfection is serving the gopis. The gopis' perfection is serving Srimati Radharani. Srimati Radharani has this mode of Sambhog Ichamai, the mood of heroine. In her case, it is Parakya. The other category of Raghunath Bhakti is Samandhunan, which is in terms of friendship and parenthood. So this is Sakhya and Vatsalya. And here again it is direct and indirect. So direct means that directly relating with Krishna in this mood, like Nand Baba or Yashoda Mai. Indirect is serving those who are directly associating with Krishna, like being a maid servant of Yashoda Mai, being a Gopa who is serving Nand Baba, right? And the general mood is Sambandha, right? It's the Vatsalya, Sakhya, Bhav. Okay. So with this we end our discussion on Raghunag Bhakti, which also ends our discussion on the first wave, which is that of Sadhana Bhakti, in which the bulk of it, the first 15 chapters talked about Vaidhi Bhakti, and then the first 14 chapters, sorry, talked about Vaidhi Bhakti, then 15th and 16th talk about Raghunag Bhakti. Srila Prabhupada ki Jai. Hare Krishna.